Hello, everyone. Welcome to this hub session that's on understanding loneliness in sport beyond the game. And I would like to welcome our two speakers today, Dr. Trish Jackman and Danielle Nutter, and I will allow them to introduce themselves. I am Antonia Ypsilanti. I am an associate professor in psychology from Sheffield Hallam University, and I co-direct the Campaign to End Loneliness. The Campaign to End Loneliness is in partnership with Neighbourly Lab, and we run the hub together. So a lot of names that you don't need to remember, but we just want to say that we're really pleased to have you with us today, and hopefully we can have a really fruitful discussion at the end. So feel free to add your questions in the chat while the speakers present, and I will do my best to collate everything in the end. And I'm sure there will be a lot of time to have a discussion on this topic after the end. So should I pass the floor to Trish first to introduce herself, and then Danielle?
Yeah, so thank you, Antonia, for that. I'm Dr. Trish Jackman, so I'm Associate Professor in Sport and Exercise Psychology at the University of Lincoln. I'm also the Chair for the Psychology Division within the Chartered Association of Sport and Exercise Sciences, otherwise known as CASES, and I'm also an Applied Sport and Exercise Psychology practitioner as well.
Danielle?
So hi everyone, thanks Antonia. I'm Danielle Nutter. I'm a first year PhD student at Sheffield Hallam University within the Health Research Institute, and I'm going to be talking a little bit later about some of the research that I'm doing. I've also been linked to the work, as Antonia mentioned, with the Campaign to End Loneliness.
Brilliant. So I think Trish, you're on first. So do you want to share the screen?
Yeah.
Just to make sure we can see everything.
Is that okay?
We can see your screen. It's not on full screen, like on a...
Yeah, sometimes I'm just trying to work out how to do that in Zoom. If I, will that version do?
Yep, that looks good.
Okay. Perfect. So thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for the really kind invite to be able to present as part of the series. So today we're going to talk a little bit about loneliness in the context of sport, and hopefully there will be some really good insights generated throughout, or some thoughts provoked as well amongst those who are in attendance too. So I myself have been involved in sport most of my life, and I suppose many of you will also have been involved at some point or another, and possibly still continue to be involved in sport. And one of the things, I suppose, with sport is that we often, we see people training, we see them competing. They're doing it surrounded by lots of people. They're often, part of groups, parts of teams. And often there may be that assumption as a result that, it is a place of connection. It is a place of belonging. And that, within a place like this, actually, people shouldn't actually feel lonely. But what I suppose some of the research has suggested, and some of the things that we've been looking at over the last couple of years, is that actually it's a little bit more complex than it seems. And we know that sport is often advocated for as a way to reduce loneliness and isolation, and certainly even from some of our own research here, we've looked at, for example, the role of sport and physical activity in the context of older people and older persons, and actually it can be a really powerful way to be able to reduce the potential for loneliness and isolation. But actually, when we look at the evidence in sport, loneliness can still be something that people experience. And what you'll notice is that what I'm speaking to, or what I was talking about today, really is actually the experience of loneliness within sport. So loneliness is certainly something that can be reduced if set up well through participation in sport. But what the evidence is starting to suggest over the last few years is that various groups of people have reported feeling lonely within the context of sport, and whether that be coaches, athletes, parents, sports officials. That evidence over the last number of years has been starting to build in different, often qualitative accounts of people's experiences within the sport context. So that presented us with a really interesting set of questions. We know that, against the backdrop of social connectedness being highlighted by the World Health Organization as a real priority area right now, and also the excellent work that's going on through the campaign, through the Neighbourly Lab and the Tactic Loneliness Hub as well. So loneliness is definitely something that's on the radar, both in the policy and practice and also in the research sphere as well. So what we did is, as this evidence is starting to accumulate in the context of sport, what we were particularly interested in was looking at what is it that we actually know? What evidence do we have? What can we take from that evidence? So what we did was what's called a systematic review. And many of you may be familiar with this, but what we've done is we've actually tried to identify every study that's out there that we could find that referred to loneliness for individuals who are involved in sport, and then try to, from that, develop kind of a shared understanding across all those studies. So looking at, as we bring together all that evidence, what are some of the conclusions we can draw based on what we know thus far, which is really helpful not only for helping us to understand what we know, but also for identifying gaps that we can try to fill as we move forward as well. So this is what we set out to do. And I know there's a lot of the questions up here on the slide. But our aim was to essentially find all of these studies that we could, to kind of synthesize them, so to collate and bring them together, and also to assess the quality of that research that had been conducted to date. So we want to know a little bit about the types of studies that have been conducted, the methods that they'd used, how people had actually described loneliness within the context of sport, what are some of its kind of characteristics, how have people tended to measure and assess it. Really importantly, and this is the one that I'm going to focus on here today, is the risk factors. So what are some factors within sport that might put people at risk of feeling lonely? What are some protective factors, and also any outcomes that might be associated with it? And also we were interested in seeing what interventions have been undertaken thus far. And in this case, we weren't necessarily looking at studies that were an intervention to reduce loneliness. What we were particularly interested in are kind of a sport-based intervention that was targeting loneliness more broadly. We were interested in any interventions that looked to reduce loneliness within the context of sport. So actually working with people who may feel lonely within sport, and how might we be able to reduce that. And this review was published in the International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology. So it's one of the principal journals in the field. And we published this last October. So our final search was conducted up to September 2024. And we found almost 200 outputs. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of work, having gone through those, read them all. A huge amount of papers that had been papers and research studies have been conducted. And what you'll see, the trend here on the right-hand side as well, gives an indication of the growth. So if you look at the actual trend, what we're seeing is that pretty much since 2010, so almost the last 15 years, we've seen a really upward trajectory there in terms of the amount of interest. But what we also did was, when we looked at those studies, we wanted to be able to determine if those studies were primarily setting out to look at loneliness, or if actually that was, something that was reported in the findings almost as a byproduct of what it was that they were trying to find out. So often that was the case in a qualitative study. So they would, the researchers may be interested in people's experiences in sport, and they reported feelings of loneliness. They didn't necessarily set out to study the topic of loneliness. So if you actually look at those 194, only about 1 in 5 of those studies specifically focused on loneliness in the context of sport, most of which were actually quantitative studies as well. So that gives an indication that although there's actually a lot of data that has gone into this particular review, in reality, there's a relatively small number of studies, around 40 studies that specifically have focused on loneliness. The majority of the participants, so this is an overview of the actual studies and the that were in the sample. So we see the majority were athletes. So even though it says 88,000 there, one of the studies actually had 55,000 of these participants. So if you can imagine, the other 193 studies had the remaining 30,000. And as I said, the majority of these were athletes. So we've kind of real underrepresentation of other really important groups within the context of sport. We can see that a lot of the studies are often multi-sport, but in terms of the single sport studies, so specific sports, football or soccer was the main one. And we tended to see that the majority of these studies were conducted in either North American or European contexts. And also worth noting that 1 in 8 were conducted during the pandemic. So we did try to factor that in when we were looking through these various studies to kind of set a bit of context around some of the findings that were generated and produced as well. Most studies in the review had used qualitative, so they would speak to people, mainly interviews, so they'd ask people about their experiences in sport. And as I said, most of these studies didn't set out to investigate loneliness, but there was qualitative reports of those experiences. So I think that's a really interesting aspect as well of how cross-cutting the topic of loneliness and the issue of loneliness is in sport, because it relates to so many other areas of exploration within our field as well. So I think that's really worth noting as well, is how connected it actually is to other topics too. And importantly, I suppose from our context, we didn't find any actual interventions that were looking within a sports sample. So let's say a group of athletes or coaches, and specifically trying to reduce loneliness in that particular context. So that was a valuable finding for us to be able to identify as well. And within sport, how do people describe it? So very similar to how it's been described in other contexts. So, athletes, coaches, parents, sports officials like referees would refer to this kind of feeling of social loneliness. So that sense of feeling alone in, the context of athletes, maybe not having friends, a feeling of social isolation. So often for coaches, feeling that I'm alone, I have no one that I can turn to for support. And often in elite sport context, that would be particularly prevalent because there's almost a fear of turning to others for support. So you continue to kind of go along and isolate oneself from others. But also this emotional loneliness. And while social loneliness kind of was the main way that people often described it, is this sense of that affection, that warmth, that bond, which is often so inherent in being part of a sports team. We have this assumption that people play together. They have to, work hard for one another. They must be good teammates. They must, you would assume often that there is that connection and that warmth and bond, but often that's not the case. And there were some, often instances of people feeling really disconnected and alienated from others within their training groups, for example, or within their teams and so on. And we also looked at the prevalence. So this was quite difficult because not many studies have actually reported on this. And also the studies that have, the measures have been quite varied. And as well as that, they're often in very small samples. So I think, there's only so much that we can really take from some of this. And also there are some kind of limitations with some of these figures as well. So if we look at some of these data, you can see that what we looked at was more intense or often not the term more problematic loneliness. So if it's something that people experience often or always, for example, or that they've reported feeling very lonely at some point. So it varied. So we see, for example, that the Brazilian high school athlete sample, disabled youth athletes, we're looking here at from 15% and under. But then we look at other samples. We look at this sample in Korea, and to note that over 50% reported feeling loneliness often or always. And in that case, that particular sample, this particular sample of young people had all attempted suicide in the previous year as well. So that's worth noting that there's additional elements or additional context to that sample. And then if we look at the US athletes again, so this is a national survey that's delivered annually over an 8-year period. And within these athletes, the over 50,000 samples across the period, more than 1 in 2 are reported feeling very lonely, but in doing that, they only reported at least once. So we don't actually have any real sense of the frequency of this, how often it is, how long it might last for, and so on. So there are some, I would say, some limitations, very strong limitations in relation to prevalence of loneliness. and how it's been measured to date. So I think that's one of the big things we've identified is the importance of better measurement and better ways of being able to understand the experience of loneliness within this context. And it's also worth noting that we only have these data in relation to athletes and not necessarily any other of the important groups that are represented in the sport context. So this is a very busy slide, and I suppose building onto this, we wanted to understand kind of what are some of the factors that influence loneliness, and also what are some of its outcomes. So we developed what's called a socio-ecological model. And what that means is that what we've tried to do is to understand or to look at the range of different factors. So often, when we look at issues in relation to loneliness or to any other psychological experiences, we might have quite a narrow focus. We might focus on the individual and what they can do. Whereas actually, as we were working through these data sets, and the volume of data that we have was great in this respect, but we saw there was a lot of different dimensions, a lot of different aspects of the environment of sport that was potentially contributing. So what we then tried to do was, as you see on the left-hand side, is to actually break these down into different layers of the sport system, all of which are going to influence one another. So they're not discrete, they don't stand alone. But actually together, it helps us to understand how complex this issue is and on all the different layers that might actually contribute to that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these different layers and some examples of that. But also here on the right-hand side, some of the outcomes that we found. And often this is more correlational data, so we can't necessarily establish cause and effect, or qualitative data. So again, more kind of research is needed around these, but nevertheless, it gives us some idea of some of the areas that may be focused upon moving forward. And I suppose one of the reasons, if we look at this question, why is it that we should be concerned about loneliness? Well, there's a variety of negative outcomes that appear to be associated with it, or just that stemmed from people feeling isolated, feeling lonely within this context. So we did see quite an amount of data around kind of mental health and ill-being. So people reporting feeling lonely, and in turn whether it would be associated mental health symptoms, or potentially also engaging in behaviors that are potentially going to cause harm to themselves as well. So we did see some evidence around mental health, and we know that that's a real concern within the context of sport, an area that's really been focused on as well. We do also see some of the evidence then around more of the cognitive, the affective, and the motivational. So, athletes often reporting just, I'm not motivated to go to training in the same way that I once was. I'm not as inclined to want to continue because I'm in this context, I'm in this team, and I don't feel like I belong or connected to others. I feel lonely, so I'm less likely to want to keep going with that. People like maybe having less confidence in themselves or lower self-esteem within the context as well. And also just eliciting some unpleasant emotions. So again, creating this kind of difficult experience within the context of sport. And in some cases, the behaviors that stem from that was a reduced performance. So, that's going to be of concern, particularly in a professional context where, people's livelihoods might be dictated by this, but crucially withdrawal from sport. And in some respects, it's almost like a bit of a double jeopardy. Not only are these people at risk of experiencing loneliness, but also, being away from the context of sport may also, have some other impact. If they're less physically active, that they might be less likely to, be able to nourish their physical and their mental health as well. So there can be like wide-ranging impacts that arise from this too. And also just some social consequences. So people, not feeling necessarily very connected with their teammates, not having the best relationship with their coaches, for example, or others within the sport environment. And in some cases, people actually stepping back or, withdrawing and not communicating in the same way with others, and also potentially being quite vulnerable. So, if people become isolated, they may be more at risk of being vulnerable within that context as well. So what are some of the factors that might contribute to this? So if we begin with the outer layer of our model, this, I suppose, is one of the elements that was really important to be able to point towards for us from a sociocultural perspective is that in sport we have a lot of kind of cultural norms, expectations, ideologies, and kind of different forces that are at play in a lot of ways. And some of these are very much entrenched. They're deeply rooted. They've been, this is how kind of sport is undertaken and some of the norms surrounding that. And what we notice is that within that, some of these norms seem to actually almost be contributing to these experiences of loneliness. So conforming to masculine norms. So masculine norms are often associated with this sense of I'm going to cope alone, I'm not going to seek help. Which, from that perspective, creates the sense that we must cope alone and normalizes that. And often that can be not just the detriment of their social health, but also their mental health as well. So help seeking might be reduced as a result of that. Cultural differences. So many people in sport will often have a cultural transition. So they move to another country to study or to work. That too can also be challenging for them as they kind of transition into that context, and there can be a real period of challenge at the start of that. So if that's not well supported, that can be another kind of transition point where loneliness could be experienced. We also saw evidence concerning kind of different kind of the representation of certain groups in sport. So for example, women are often underrepresented in sport contexts. We often, the kind of white male is often the traditional makeup of a lot of sport contexts. So anyone who may identify other than that may feel loneliness in those contexts as well. And also this notion of the sport ethic. So in sport, if you look for many years, we have this notion of what the ideal athlete is, or the real athlete. And often to be a real athlete, it's this sense that you need to kind of work hard. You need to almost be willing to kind of experience pain and, continue on playing injured. And often, these norms that are perpetuated can be really problematic. They put, people at risk in terms of their physical and their mental health. But also from that perspective, people being unwilling to seek help, that kind of connects to this notion of masculine norms as well. So some of these kind of norms and the cultural aspects can certainly play a role in that, contribute to loneliness. We also saw from an institution, so if we think about institution, how we framed this was more almost like a sports club or an organization and how it's set up. And also, I suppose, the context of sport and some of the sport-specific challenges one might encounter. So adverse events, in particular injury, was a huge one there. So when an athlete is injured, or if they experience a concussion, or if they have a poor performance, they can be potential periods where loneliness might be experienced and where they may feel lonely. The injured athlete is a really clear example, because often athletes might be out for 6, 9, 12 months. So that can be a real period when they might be on their own in the gym, and that can be really challenging and really difficult for them. Lack of support. So if people don't feel well supported, especially if they've had a transition into a club, or that can be a real challenge as well. And also they don't feel like they fit in. So, often we see that in the junior to senior transition in professional sport often. So when people move from being, let's say, in an academy into a professional environment, they suddenly go from being kind of the top of one environment and they're kind of new entrants into another environment, often with people who may be, much older than them and from different backgrounds. So that can be a real challenge. And also challenges and concerns surrounding performance. So there's a lot of pressure and expectation, which can in turn result in people feeling that, a lot of weight on their shoulders, and that they have to be able to try and cope alone with that as well. Interpersonal relationships were also a real challenge too. So, in different formats, but in essence, if there are relationships that have some difficulties, if we don't feel supported, for example, by our coaches or by our support team, or actually we feel very isolated and separated from our teammates, those can be real problems. And we also saw in relation to that kind of social exclusion, often people almost, feeling that they were being bullied within sport context, that they were being excluded and left out, which in turn creates a sense that you don't belong here, and this isn't a place for you. And again, resulting in, people feeling very much on their own and lonely within this context. And also that sense of withdrawal, stepping back from those relationships. And I think, some of these quotes that we see that I've presented here on the screen kind of allude to some of these elements as well. This sense of, the teammates in this case not feeling like, you wanted to be there or that they wanted you there, all of which can contribute to feeling very, very alone. And then lastly, we didn't have a huge amount of evidence at the individual level, but I think, one of the ones that connects to some of the earlier slides as well is this sense of, suppressing emotions and coping alone. So sport can be a really demanding environment. People experience very intense emotions. And often it's this kind of the norm is that you should be able to kind of cope with those emotions, be able to, use some type of strategies and be able to do that alone. Whereas actually, often the best thing is to be able to seek that help. But because of the normalization of that kind of coping approach, that in turn can actually have a real negative impact. So often, we may see people who may appear to be really coping well or demonstrating such behaviors, but they could be really feeling very alone underneath it all. So there can be, I think that's one of the kind of the challenges, the misnomers, as it were, regarding loneliness in the context of sport. And I suppose as I've kind of painted that picture around some of the risk factors, well, what are some of the things that can help? We don't have as much evidence around this. We've looked at specifically at loneliness as opposed to social connections. So I think that's important to point out. But within the studies that we did have, what we noted was the importance of those social relationships. So having high quality relationships. And often that's a real challenge in sport. Maybe, there's such a performance focus in many environments. I think in recent years, there has been much more of a shift towards the importance of having a holistic and balanced approach to sport performance. But actually, allowing time for those relationships to be able to develop is really crucial and really, really important, and ensuring that, we are making a concerted effort to support everyone within those environments as well. And also at the individual level, I think one of the key elements here is the involvement of sport. So despite the fact that, there are things that might put people at risk of feeling lonely in sport, the cross-sectional, and I would say it is cross-sectional evidence in the main, but there is some more kind of prospective, kind of longer-term studies. But in the main, what we do tend to see is that people in sport do tend to report lower loneliness than those outside of sport. So what I would say is that sport can be a really positive context, is what we tend to see, and what we can probably, some of the evidence suggests, at least in that line. But that if sport isn't set up as well as it can be, there is potential for people to still feel lonely. So again, it's that importance of how we create those environments that nurture those connections. That's really important. And also the importance of, sharing struggles and seeking help. So rather than coping alone, actually, are we actively seeking out others who we can get some support from? That's really important as well. So from an applied perspective, this is my final slide. And I think these are some of the key takeaways that from our systematic review and the paper that we worked on. And it first is really around what we call a tripartite approach. And what that means is more like, our suggestion would be that based on the different layers within sport, that would be really valuable for us to almost have a three-pronged approach, where we look at different groups within sport, but also this could be really relevant from more of a public health perspective and population level. How can we ensure sport is a place where it can be harnessed in order to reduce loneliness at a population level? So the first of that three-pronged approach could be just having a general approach, a general kind of awareness raising, for example, about loneliness in the context of sport, which is much more about the entire sport ecosystem, as it were, and being able to address that. So we're having that broader approach. The second level then we'll be looking at, right, who are the potentially at-risk people? So based on the evidence that we have to date, who might be some of the at-risk groups to experience loneliness? And what might we do specifically to be able to ensure that we reduce the likelihood of that happening? Okay, so that's our second group. And then our third group could be, well, who are those who may already be feeling lonely? And what might we do to be able to reduce the feelings of loneliness that may exist for them? So by having that kind of different approach, that tiered approach almost, as it were, we're being able to maybe address the different groups and also ensuring we have that really focused support around those who need it most. within the context of sport, having, being able to ensure that we focus on the interpersonal level, that's so, so important. Often there's the sense that, we go through sport and people are able to flourish and thrive because they have a great mindset. But the reality is that people don't behave, think and feel in a vacuum. They're surrounded by people. So if we can emphasize the importance of those relationships as soon as they come through the gates and into our sports clubs and sport environments, the way in which we interact with them is going to make a difference. So how can we make each of those interactions count and create those really positive and warm relationships that will, as a result of that, ensure that people don't feel lonely and don't feel that, they are alone within that context. Within any organizations or staff who might work directly within the context of sport and with athletes, with coaches, with sport officials, for example, anyone who may be at risk of loneliness, it's important to understand what some of these risk factors might be. So taking into account maybe what you've heard today, thinking about how might that apply in my context? Are there processes, are there kind of norms for behavior that actually might be contributing to loneliness and that maybe we may need to just reflect on that? Or are there actually some practices that are really great that we should continue to do because that's really helping to ensure that we're protecting everyone in our sport environment from this experience? I think also what's really good for us to reflect on is some of the norms and narratives in sport, this sense that we must cope alone, that we should not seek help. And for us to be able to, just challenge and consider some of these alternatives, and that actually performance, health, and social relationships can all coexist. And that actually investing in our relationships is really important because, long after we maybe stop being involved in sport as a competitive athlete, we'll probably still continue to be active, hopefully in some way, and we'll want to continue to maintain our friendships that we always had. So being able to focus on the importance of relationships is key. And then given the kind of connectedness between loneliness and mental health in sport, also being aware of the potential role that it can play within the mental health space as well in sports. We know that's a real priority area. For those of you who don't know, there's actually a conference in November, the Global Alliance for Mental Health in Sport. They have their conference. It's going to be in London. So, I think mental health in sport is definitely, something that's much more on the radar, and a conference like that will bring together a lot of the research and practice around this space. But I think, being able to consider loneliness within that would be of real value, especially because of those relationships that we did find. And yeah, you can contact me after today at any point. There's my details. You'll find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and also my email address as well. So Antonio, I'm just going to hand back to you, and then Danielle, it'll be over to you as well.
Amazing. Thank you, Trish. That's so interesting. I've read the paper quite a long time ago, and I found it fascinating the way that you layered your approach, and I think that kind of at-risk people, preventative, and also people that are currently lonely is really, really important in all places, but more so in sport as well. So Danielle, I mean, there is a question that I would like to ask you, but can we do it after Danielle, if that's okay? So that we kind of give enough time to her as well to complete her presentation. So Danielle, do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, that's fine. So can I just check that you can see that okay?
Looks good to me, Danielle.
Yep, very good.
Thank you. Okay, so hi again, everyone. So as I mentioned before, I'm Danielle Nutter. I'm a PhD student and graduate teaching assistant at Sheffield Hallam University within the Health Research Institute. I'm in the first year of my PhD, so I don't particularly have a lot of data to share with you at the moment, but kind of as an umbrella term, I'm researching understanding loneliness within the context of elite sport. I'm just checking. Have we moved on? Can you all see that?
Yes, it's looking good, Danielle.
Absolutely. Perfect. Okay. So in the loneliness literature, contrary to the myth that loneliness occurs a lot in older adults, we have actually found there's a relationship with loneliness in age, and it's this U-shaped kind of non-linear figure, which you can see on the screen here, whereby those in young adulthood have been found to have high levels of loneliness in different forms. The loneliness levels then dip towards kind of middle age and then rise again into later adulthood. And the reason we're so interested in this is because if you can look where that nice round green blob is, that's the age of athletes that are usually at their peak performance age, which does vary by sport. A lot of athletes are kind of getting into that mastery stage around the age of 18 and looking at retirement age around 29, but that really does vary, you know, based on the actual sport itself. So Trish has just talked a lot about the existing research in loneliness and sport. So I'm just kind of going to add to that, but this will overlap a little bit. So a lot of the research has been done on multiple sports. And what I mean by that is within a research study that's been done, the sample has included several different sports. For example, boxing, swimming, football, netball, etc. Which is great because we're getting a lot of information on different sports. However, we're not necessarily getting the distinctions between, you know, what could be different in basketball to football, for example. And within those distinctions, you know, what could be considered an individual sport such as swimming, and a team sport such as football, and how loneliness could present differently because of the relationships and differences within the training and the lifestyle that these athletes might experience. And then where research has looked into a specific sport, so for example, the sample is just on one sport. The sport has often been, as Trish mentioned, something like soccer or football, and these are lacking in individual sports such as, you know, gymnastics, running, swimming, cycling, etc. The other thing we've found when looking at loneliness in sport is there's a real variation in the athletic level, and this can be comparing athletes with non-athletes to find the benefits of physical activity on loneliness levels. It could be looking at junior elite athletes, collegiate athletes, and then there is obviously some literature that has been done on elite international level athletes. However, this is spread across a lot of studies, and as we've talked about in its later down this slide, there's actually only a fifth of the studies that were included in the systematic review that look at loneliness as a primary outcome. So if you imagine that spread across all these different athletic levels, it's not actually a lot of data for specific elite athletes. A lot of sport literature does look at mental health conditions within athletes, such as anxiety, stress, and depression, which is great, and we've found out lots of information about these. But as I've just mentioned, it is lacking in understanding loneliness, which we know is becoming more and more prevalent in the world. And again, as we've just talked about, the primary outcome was loneliness in only a fifth of the research articles included in the systematic review. Loneliness is also, when looked at quantitative measures, is usually looked at direct measures. There's one of the scales, such as the UCLA loneliness scale, and there's different versions of this that have been revised over the years. But these are scales that are validated and reliable, but they are more in relation to use with the general population, and there is no loneliness sport scale specifically for athletes. And it does kind of beg the question whether we could be learning more if we're asking athletes specific loneliness sport questions. And then the final thing to mention is the gender differences. So whilst a lot of research does talk about gender differences within sport, this is often in the context of mental health conditions such as anxiety, stress, depression, and we don't necessarily know a lot about how loneliness differs between genders in sport. So this links with some of what Trish was talking about as well. But one of the things that comes up in the research is the athlete identity, and whether an athlete chooses to be exclusively an athlete focusing on that career, or whether they choose to have a triple career, which could be seen as an athlete who also goes to work and also has an education. And then, later on, there might be an additional element to add to this, which is the family life. But what we've got to think about within the athlete population is the unconventional lifestyles that they lead that might be considered different to the societal norms. And what I'm going to pop on the screen now is all of the different kind of factors that are in play when we look at the literature. So, for example, we've got to think about athletes that travel abroad, whether that's, they're being sold to another club in football, or whether they're traveling for events. And with that, there's many factors in itself, such as sleep, language, time differences. How does that interact with their family life? So there's lots of kind of various factors in play here. Security, for example, can relate to finances. So a lot of athletes are on sponsorship deals. It also links to their injury. If they're injured and they can't compete, what does that look like for the sponsorship deals? And that links to the pressures that they might face. So there's loads of different layers within an athlete's lifestyle, which might be different to someone who's not an athlete, that need to be considered, that could link to feelings of loneliness. Which kind of links to this next slide, where we look at loneliness within the self, others, and with places. So how does one feel within their self and loneliness? But as Trish mentioned, you can be around lots of different people at an event within your club, but do you feel like you have meaningful connections with those teammates? There's a lot of competition between teammates because you might want to be selected for a team, so you might not want to disclose that you're feeling lonely or you're struggling with your mental health, because that could be perceived by athletes as working against you. So there's some stigma kind of around discussing mental health with others. And then the other area to think about is loneliness within the places. So, you might have a specific sporting ground that you have a particular connection to. And if you're migrating to a new country, that's somewhere else that you've got to form a connection to. And with the places itself, there's a lot of extra factors that go into how you might connect to that place and how that could affect your feelings of belonging within the sporting community or not. So as we've talked about as well, in the literature and the research that's been done so far, often we do look at athletes, and that's in a wealth of the data. But quite often we also talk about these other sports ecosystem members, such as family, coaches, partners, teammates. And this is, I suppose, what is often seen as the key kind of support network that athletes have. But what is less seen in the literature is what this could be. And actually, what you can see in red now coming on the screen, I think there may be a couple more, are other influencers who actually could be people that athletes open up to talk about how they're feeling, or indeed there could actually be influences that could be influencing their loneliness, for example. So there's lots of different sports ecosystem members that athletes link up with, which we actually don't really know a lot about, and how that could be affecting how an athlete is feeling day to day. So with all this in mind, where am I heading? So what I can share with you is that my research is really trying to understand loneliness. So it's really trying to gain a deeper perspective of what could be a precipitating event, how athletes are experiencing loneliness, and to really get some new empirical data on this. And with this in mind, to actually understand loneliness, it's really important to look at this from a qualitative methodology, which is more to do with kind of interviewing athletes, rather than getting them to complete a survey. Whilst this can provide some information, we don't believe it's going to help us understand in the context of what we would like to for this PhD. I've chosen to look at a single sport. I'm not going to disclose what that is, but we're going to look at a single sport. As I mentioned earlier, there's some of the gaps in the existing literature. Whilst we know lots of information about lots of different sports, what we don't know is the intricacies of certain sports, and actually this will help to get a greater understanding, and that could help with some of the interventions that we don't know too much about at the moment. And then also, as I've just mentioned, speaking with a range of members in the sports ecosystem. So that's like family, friends, teammates. Whilst these are really important, it'll be really interesting to see if we can gain the perspectives of other people who are very involved in the sporting community, but actually aren't necessarily always included in the research, such as volunteers, for example. These are my references, and if you'd like to contact me after today, my details are on the screen now. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Danielle. Very, very helpful. And thank you for kind of both supplementing each other in common themes that have kind of been found in both research evidence pieces that you both did. Can I ask a question to Trish that's on the chat as well? Did you find any evidence of therapeutic alliance, like connection to physios, for example? Andrea is asking. Any comments or anything? Yeah.
Yeah, so I might address, actually, I think there's some really good points that you've made in relation to the transition piece. So yeah, lots of different transitions, often, becoming a professional, that cultural transition, particularly also the transitions that can occur. I suppose football was a particularly big one. So, as a 16-year-old moving away to an academy, for example, kind of that sense of being alone in that context, moving away, but also potentially moving from club to club, almost this sense of almost having to restart those connections, those relationships, but also being aware of the potential, how fragile a career can often be as well. That you may actually be moving, if you're out on loan for 6 months as well, for half of a season. What does that look like? And also, I suppose the retirement was another one. You step away, you have the support for most of your career, and often athletes just felt like they were just left, and that was it. And they'd almost, that sense of who am I, my identity, that athletic identity that's so built up with that too. And as well as that, I suppose some other kind of transition, as I said, the junior to senior, that was another piece, but also a couple of interesting ones too. And it connects in, actually, it was some of the work around the Homeless World Cup, and this sense of, the team had been working towards something for so long, and then the event was over, and everyone went their different ways again. That sense of, actually, it's almost like this juncture just comes apart, as it were. So that sense of, how do we support athletes after competition? So we often see that build up for 4 years around the Olympics and the Paralympics. And we do now see a lot more emphasis on decompression, for example, afterwards, and that will be in place. That plan will be in place for post-event. But in the aftermath of these events, ensuring that athletes aren't alone is really key. And in terms of the alliance, so some of the social support providers are really key. Anyone who may have an opportunity, especially, let's say, an injured athlete. So certainly in the applied work that I do, we would look at, a number of different support providers, whether it be the S&C staff, the physio, player care, myself as a psychologist. So, having that multiple perspective is really key. And also having that person that you can trust. So I think one of the quotes alluded to that sense of, if you feel that you can share with that person, that can be really empowering as well. So hopefully that's addressed your question, Andrea.
Yeah, it has. Thank you very much. Really interesting.
Lambros, do you want to come in?
Hi there, thank you. Thanks, Trish and Danielle, fantastic presentations. Love them both. Just a question to both of you, and I'm following on from Andrea's question about critical points in one's career, like dual transition, right? So dual career transition from being an athlete to being a non-athlete. That has an impact on identities, how people identify themselves, what they want to do with their lives. How do you think we can assess loneliness? Have you seen any evidence about loneliness specifically being more acute in these transition stages from being an athlete to retiring and doing something else with their lives? Or if you think that if you haven't seen any evidence, would you theorize that probably that's another area where we could be looking at?
Danielle, do you want to have a go at that first?
Yeah, so some of the, I suppose, literature that I've read that's talked about that transition generally kind of talks about if an athlete has a multiple identity. So, that they've got a network outside of the sporting community, that generally they cope better with the transition, and they generally cope better than those who have the unidimensional identity. With that in mind, to my knowledge, Trish, you might be able to let me know here, but I haven't read any research that I think specifically talks about that in the context of loneliness. I think it's just in terms of kind of looking at the transitions and how people deal with that in terms of a stress response rather than directly with loneliness. But Trish, you might be able to let me know if I've missed it.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's certainly nothing kind of more longitudinal that looks at multiple time points over time. So I think that probably speaks to that we don't necessarily have that quantitative measured evidence, and more probably from qualitative accounts. What we do, from practice perspective, I know there's been some work in recent years around, particularly in football, best practices for around cultural transitions, acknowledging the fact that often, especially in the context of football, those cultural transitions, those initial periods, that being able to have really good support around that is important. But often, I suppose, the topic of loneliness per se mightn't be addressed, but actually the importance of social network, relationship development, and so on might be more emphasized. But yeah, certainly these kind of more temporal patterns over time is something that we haven't necessarily got a huge amount of evidence around as yet.
Great, thank you.
And also Trish shared the link to the systematic review that they've done. Lambros was also the co-author, just to mention that while you're here, Lambros, of that systematic review. So well done to you both and the team more widely. Can I just ask like a very quick question, Trish? I mean, we're talking about mapping out what is happening in the sport. Is there any kind of like studies or reviews on interventions to tackle or manage all of these things, as you've explained, which are quite prominently those transition points? And like a quick comment. I don't want to overdo it.
No, so I think it's probably more bespoke around the challenges, as Danielle alluded to, often the stressors around that, as opposed to loneliness per se. I suppose the one thing about sport is we're talking about competitive sport, and there is some other work that is more around physical activity and its role from the point of view of reducing loneliness at a kind of a population level. But in terms of specific transition point pieces, there will be some there, but not around loneliness.
Okay, so maybe some work to be done also, like kind of tailoring things alongside the measurement issues that you've both clearly mentioned within that space. So thank you everyone for joining us. Abba has put links to our hub groups. So we have specific groups within the hub, and you're welcome to join. Thank you, Trish and Danielle, our two excellent speakers, for such lovely presentations, really insightful. And thanks everyone for joining. There is a very quick survey, just a reminder, as you leave the Zoom meeting, please give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you in one of our next webinars. Very nice to see everyone.
Thank you, Antonia, for hosting. Thank you, Ava. Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me.
Everyone. Thank you.